Welcome to the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we want to remind you of some housekeeping. You will stay muted throughout the live session, so we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to be either 1 or 1.5 hours long, including questions. To ask the speakers a question, use the stage chat found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do not ask questions for the live session in the main events chat. This session will be recorded and will be available to watch again on the AHDB Potatoes YouTube channel and the AHDB website. At the end of the session, we will provide you with a unique basis and Noroso code, which you should keep note of for each session that you attend. Don't forget to apply for points using the basis and Noroso application forms, which can be found in the reception area. Join the conversation online by following AHDB Potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag SpotFarmResults2020. Finally, if you have any issues with the conference platform, contact the team on events@ahdb.org.uk. We hope that you enjoy the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. Your session will now start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us for the Spot Results Week session on storage and managing sprout suppression without CIPC. I hope that you've enjoyed the week so far, and it's been really great to have so many of you join us. So I'm Laura, I'm based at Sutton Bridge and work on Potato Storage Knowledge Exchange. And today I'm delighted to be joined by James Oliver, Simonfaulkner and Adrian Britton for a panel discussion. So the way we'll run the session is that I'll present results from spot trials relating to maleic hydrazine application and dormancy. And then we'll do a round of introductions from the panel before going to the discussion and Q&A with everybody. And you'll have just heard from Richard in the housekeeping on how to feed in your questions. So as an industry, we no longer have CIPC to rely on for sprout control, and I think it's fair to say that the last couple of years and the past year in particular have been challenging on a number of storage fronts as a result. So there are a number of options available to growers for sprout control, but none really are like-for-like replacements of CIPC. So in today's session, I'd like to bring your attention to two of these options that have been explored in the network of AHDB strategic potato farms, and that's specifically MH application optimization and the development of dormancy rankings. So focusing on MH first, MH is widely used in the industry to control volunteers in the field, as well as controlling sprouting in stores. And we know that these are the uses that are stated on the label, but I think it's fairly well established as well that MH can help with secondary growth and internal sprouting. And this specifically is something that has been observed in storage trials at Sutton Bridge. So we know that MH is a very effective sprout suppressant in reducing sprout growth. And we also see that in the sprouting data from Sutton Bridge, that this works really well when combined with other sprout suppressants. So sprout control is enhanced when you're using a combination of MH and ethylene or mint oil, for example. So going forward, we really see MH as a key baseline element to implement sprout control in the future. But in order for that efficacy to be there in stores, we really need those residues to be present in the tubers, and that all starts with application in the field. And in the field, of course, it's not just about sprout suppression. There's other factors that come into play, such as your crop yield and achieving a good skin set. And going back to yield, early application has been associated with a yield penalty. So, do you potentially risk that by going for an early application, or do you delay that and push for that yield, but potentially risk applying to a canopy that's starting the senescence process? So it'd actually be really interesting to hear from your experiences in this decision making, and whether you're an advisor or a grower, how do you go about weighing those different elements, and how do you approach that timing of application? So please do fit in your experiences in the chat, and then we can build on those in our discussion. So the crucial thing to consider is ensuring uptake for sprout growth reduction in stores, and evidence shows that we need to get better at applying MH. So how can we optimize that application process to increase that uptake from the leaves and into the tubers? So this is something that's been explored at Spot North and Spot West in 2019 and 2020. And the trial specifically looked at variability, which we know is one of the issues when it comes to using malic hydroside. So the trial consisted of 3 different varieties tested under different MH dose rates, so at 10, 25, 50 and 100%. So for each plant, tubers were divided into 2 subsamples based on size, with 1 sample going for residue testing immediately after lifting, and then the other going into storage for 150 days at 9 degrees Celsius. So it's quite interesting looking at the results from the residue testing, and particularly when you consider the MRL of MH at 60 parts per million. So as expected, we see an increase in the mean presence of residue in proportion to the dose rate applied. But what's actually quite interesting is that the highest residue value observed in the trials sits at almost 19 ppm. So we're getting about a third of the MRL when it's applied at the full label rate. And I know there that Piper and Sakita were both grown at Spot North, but it's likely a coincidence that they show similar residue levels. So, with this in mind, how do these residue concentrations translate into efficacy in store? So these are images from the different treatments, and we can really see the effect of these MH residues on sprout growth, and in this case, that's for a variety Titan. So again, so that's after storage at 9 degrees C for 150 days. So as you increase the dose rate, you can visibly see a level of efficacy and a reduction in sprouting, but that relationship isn't as linear as you might think. And this actually becomes more obvious once plotted. So what we've got here is weights of sprouts against average MH residue concentrations. And what this figure tells us is that little residue has little effect, and as residue levels do increase, we see a much more pronounced response. So in order to see some really good levels of sprout control efficacy, what we need to do really is move beyond that steep curve there that you see at the beginning. And the literature points towards a mean residue of 12 ppm as a good number to refer to, but there's more to it than this this mean of 12 ppm, and we can see that from the figure you still get some sprouting at this level of concentration. And at higher levels, we see that the response tails off quite a bit. So when taking a closer look at the data, that's when we really start to see that issue of variability that I talked about earlier. So I showed you this this graph earlier, and when you take a look at the actual distribution for 10 plants, that's really when you start to see the extent of this variability from plant to plant. So the minimum value of MH residue is 50 to 60% of the average, while the maximum is around 150% of that average. So you actually have a proportion of plants that have taken up very little maleic hydrazide, despite the full dose rate having been applied. So, what's causing this source of variation? And we'd be interested to hear from your experiences actually, and how can we improve the application so that this variability is reduced? So, again, if you've got any ideas from what you've observed in the field and from your experiences, do share those with us in the chat, and we'll discuss them in more detail during the Q&A. So in addition to plant-to-plant variability, something else that was observed in the trials was tuber-to-tuber variety in each subsample. So you can see that the smaller tubers show sprouts and larger sprouts compared to the larger tubers. And I guess this kind of makes sense because smaller tubers will have received less MH residues due to their size. But what this example highlights is that MH doesn't move everywhere in the plant equally. So something to consider and bear in mind as well. So overall, there's the data from the spot trial suggests that we can really get more out of the application process, and we can get more MH into the crop to really reap those rewards when it comes to storage and reducing sprouting in stores. But how do we actually go about that? So I think the key thing to bear in mind here is always have humidity in mind when it comes to applying, and we'll be discussing the practicalities of application in the discussion. So again, please share with us your experiences, or if you've got any questions, then we can discuss those during the Q&A. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that another piece of work that was done as part of the spot trials was looking at dormancy and developing dormancy rankings. And that was done at Spot West and Spot North. And there, the aim was to develop dormancy rankings based on a wide range of varieties. And in addition to MH and the other sprout suppressants currently available, variety traits with longer dormancy also have their role to play in improving sprout controls and reducing storage costs as well. So this is something that we wanted to have a look in more detail. So for this particular trial, 40 varieties representative of commonly grown ones and newer and upcoming varieties were planted at both sites. We had 50 tubers for each variety stored at 15 degrees Celsius. So, slightly higher temperature there, but that was to encourage sprouting and from an assessment perspective, really be able to see those differences between varieties. And dormancy was measured as the time from tuber initiation to when 50% of the tubers had sprouts of a certain size, so 3 millimeters or more. So sprouting here is used as an indicator of dormancy break. And the graph at the bottom here is a really good illustration of how different varieties sprout at different times, and that indicates that dormancy breaks at different times. So when looking at these dormancy rankings, so based on days from tuber initiation, what really emerges is that dormancy is a continuum, and categorizing varieties into short, dormant, medium, or long is actually not that evident. So in addition to that, what's really quite striking from this figure here is the large variation amongst varieties. And we see that from the shortest to the longest dormant, there's a variation span of nearly 2 months. So a lot of variation there. Now, another interesting point about this piece of work is the differences in dormancy that we observe between sites, and in particular, if you look at Marquise, then there's actually a month difference in dormancy duration between those sites. Now, at the moment, we don't quite know yet what's causing that difference. Seed stocks were the same, storage conditions were the same, and if the variation related to if the variation we think was relating to sites, you'd be able to see that across all the varieties, which isn't the case here. So we still don't quite know what piece of the puzzle we're missing here. So jury's still out there on that one, what's causing that difference. So when looking at the relationship between days to 50% sprouting and storage temperature, we see that lower temperature extends dormancy quite considerably. And with the dormancy rankings now available, what we'd really like to see in the future is be able to predict dormancy at actual store temperatures, based on the data that was collected for 15 degrees storage conditions. And again, going back to those rankings, these do offer an additional tool as part of the storage toolkit, and provide support in that decision making when it comes to variety selection. Obviously, we know that dormancy isn't the only factor that comes into play. There's yield, there's disease resistance, but at least that this gives everybody an additional pool of information to draw on when you're selecting varieties to grow for the following year. So, just to summarise, we've seen from the data of spot trials that we can get more out of MH application, and really push that a bit more, so we can get better efficacy in store and reduce costs as well. And obviously, we've just seen that dormancy data is available, so there's choice there and more information accessible to everybody. Now, MH and naturally long dormancy are some of the options available in the storage toolkit. It's important to consider them in the context of your store environment, what options are available to you based on your market and your store setup. There are other sprout suppressants available, but we know that ethylene and mint oil do need a different approach to storage and need more careful management. And I also wanted to leave you with that figure here on, and take some time to consider integrated store management. I think it'll be a crucial approach to take in the future, because the sprout suppressants available we now have on like-for-like replacements for CIPC. So there'll be several things there to think about. So that gives you hopefully a whistle-stop tour of hopefully that gives you a whistle-stop tour of the data that we've managed to gather at spot sites. So I'd now like to bring in our panelists. So James, Simon, and Adrian, it'd be great to discuss those questions that people have been feeding in. Lovely to see you and join me. So I guess start by a round of and starting with James, then going to Simon and Adrian. So over to you, James.
Yep, good afternoon, everyone. So for those that don't know me from before, then I've taken over recently as farm manager at Gatley Farms in North Herefordshire back in the spring. Before that, I was an agronomist for 12 years with Agri and RM Jones in Herefordshire. As an agronomist, it gave me a good insight into several farm businesses in the area and their pros and cons and their different styles and techniques. So it gave me a fairly good grounding, really. Gatley itself is a fairly interesting farm. We're based in North Herefordshire in a valley that has its own microclimate, so it offers its own challenges. We're farming about 1,000 hectares, all in all, 600 hectares of which are owned, mostly grade 3, grade 4 sort of soils, fairly marginal land, some of it. We've got some shallow soils. We've got a quarry on farm, which sort of indicates our issues there with shallow soils. And then we've got some fairly steep banks and north-facing banks that are quite difficult to farm. Predominantly silty clay loams. We do have issues, obviously, with our shallower soils, sometimes with stones and rocks, but generally it's pretty good. We are looking to we're looking on the 6-year rotation with our potatoes and growing combinable crops within that rotation. We have storage for 5,000 tons, cold storage, all in boxes. So we're looking to grow around about 100 hectares a year of those of potatoes. We have, as well as being the new Spot West farm for the West, for the AHDB, we also run trials alongside Agri, and we have 560 replicated wheat plots, 88 oat plots, and we're doing some resistant ryegrass work and yellow rust screening work. So we're fairly busy.
Thanks, James. It'll be quite interesting to discuss how you've gone about MH application this year. But I guess we'll come back to that in the discussion. Simon, over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name's Simonfaulkner, and I'm an independent agronomist and consultant. Have been doing that for about the last 5 years. But before that, I worked for a produce company called Produce World for about 20 years, predominantly on potatoes.
And you've been advising on storage as well as part of the storage network and things. Yeah. So it'll be quite interesting to hear your views on that and the data from the spot trials.
Yes, I currently look after about 25,000 tons of storage.
Right. Thanks, Simon. Adrian.
Hi, I'm Adrian Britton. I work for AHDB at Sutton Bridge. I'm a food technologist by training, but for the last 15 or 20 years, I've been working pretty much exclusively on sprout control, sprout suppressants, and that kind of thing.
Lovely, thank you everybody for these introductions. So we've had some questions come in on MH in particular. So I guess a question for Adrian and Simon from Andrew Wilson: has a physiological age any influence on MH uptake? Is that something that you've seen in trials?
Sorry, the physiological age. I'm not aware of that specifically. The physiology of the crop obviously has an important impact on it, and that is probably one of the reasons why MH applications are so difficult, because we've got this whole level that we need to control. That is the condition of the crop at the time of application. And some of that information is established, but I think by no means all of it. So some of the work that we're doing, in fact, the work that you showed, Laura, where we're looking at various plant to plant, it was fairly basic work that is, and we don't understand, we don't know about that information. So there is not a lot of research that has happened since maleic hydrazide was first introduced 50 years ago.
Simon, what's your views on that one?
Yes, no, I just sort of tend to agree with Adrian on that one, and which is what is making it so difficult for growers and advisors to make a decision on application on MH, because every variety will probably be at a different stage, or could be at a different stage when you want to put your MH on. So it is something that is obviously something we need to consider more and more.
So, James, I think that'd be interesting then to hear from you about how you've gone about those challenges, you know, when it comes to applying MH in the field, and perhaps relate that back to your agronomy days as well.
Yeah, so I think if we relate back to my agronomy days, one of the sort of the biggest discussions, headaches, arguments that I used to have with growers was the timing of MH. So I would be keen to get it on in sort of good time with good growing conditions and good weather conditions. And it was always a battle to try and fight against that extra week's growth or that extra week's development. And it did on occasion lead to crops going over senescing, and then obviously we weren't getting the best from MH. But it's that battle over sort of getting the timing right and maximising yield, I guess. But I think as we mentioned, really, it's very important to do on a field by field basis and a variety basis as best you can, and just get the conditions as close to good as you can get. There's so many variable factors; it's very difficult.
And on your farm, you know, last year in 2020, how did you go about the MH applications? What challenges did you have in the field then, and what was it like?
Yeah, it was very hot actually during that time. The spring came early for us at Gatley this time, and so planting was relatively early. We got most of the planting done in the first fortnight of April. So around about between the 10th and the 18th of April, something like that, was the majority of the planting done. And so we got the crops established and away early. And then it came. We actually applied the MH on around about the 21st to the 28th of July, which was in a period that was very warm and very dry. So that presented some challenges. We actually left it sort of late evening to apply the MH, and we applied it in. We bought a new set of nozzles this time so that we could apply it at 400 litres a hectare water volume, and applied it as a standalone product. In the past, I mean, I knew a lot of growers that were mixing it with blight products and just going on with the blight application. I think that had its issues as well. So, you know, it's all detailed on the label. If you're looking at, just take Phaser, for example, it runs through all these things. And we just felt that this year, with the loss of CIPC, we wanted the MH to do its best job. So we just tried to go by the book, really, and do it as best as we could. Yeah,
so you mentioned split dosing there. We've had a question come in on that. So any benefit of split dose application, 30 degrees heat a week after application, hit Royal hard this season. You know, half a tramline done with 2 times or twice half rate a week apart wasn't hit as hard. So yeah, it's an interesting experience there. I don't know what your views on that are, Adrian and Simon, specifically on the split dosing, applying a split dose.
Got to be a bit careful on that. But I know there's people looking at trials with split dosing it and with mixing it with fungicides. And I know there's people out there currently mixing it with a fungicide anyway, because otherwise you're increasing another application through your crop. But generally speaking, you've got to stick to the label unless you're very confident what you're doing.
And Adrian, there's just a point there on clarification in terms of the actual trials. Were the varieties all treated on the same day, and is foliage maturity playing a part in uptake?
Yeah, can I just add to that last point? So with regard to split dosing, so that is off label and not supported by the approval holders. So that is entirely at grower's own risk. With regard to the trials, so the Titan crop was based at Spot West, or was at Spot West, and the Hyper, the other two varieties were at Spot North. So they went at separate sites. So comparison is quite difficult. Timing wise, that was quite similar, but obviously if the sites are different, then comparison is different. I would say that the residue level that we observed, so something like 19 in the Titan, 12, 13, 14 parts per million in the other two varieties, is relatively good. So we see a lot of crops coming into Sutton Bridge that have lower residue levels than that. In fact, the last season, so the season which this crop also came from, probably the average residue level was well below 10 ppm, so somewhere between 5 and 10. So I think growers can get a lot more out of maleic, or many growers can get a lot more out of maleic hydroside than they have.
And then going back to this issue of variability as well, we've had a question, or physiological age too, had a question there on, so in a hot season, we can see sprouting of the daughter tubers in the field in June. Should we be using physiological age as a tool to decide application time instead of weeks from burn off? Simon, would you like to take that one?
It's something we perhaps need to look at, because as I say, every crop is responding, or every variety is responding differently, I think, and requires a different timing. So whether we can look at dormancy and determancy and things like that on varieties, it might be beneficial to application timing.
James, what are your views on this question? And then, you know, is that something you've observed as well in the field when applying MH?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily something that I've observed in the field in the past, but I do agree with Simon. I think it's something that would justify further work and looking into. It could be a good option for us.
Okay, well, in terms of further work, we've got a question here on that. So, has any work been done to look at MH application alone versus mixing with a blight spray or oil and subsequent water volume? Adrian, perhaps you'd like to answer that one.
Okay, right. With regard to water volume, so I think with a maleic hydroside application, what we're actually looking for is a long period of high humidity to prevent the formulation from drying out on the leaf. When we're applying fungicide, that isn't necessarily what we're looking for. In fact, it probably isn't what we're looking for. So they would tend to go on lower volumes. So that is quite different, but also importantly, the approval holders aren't generally supporting tank mixing with oils or with fungicides. So if we read the label, we're discouraged from doing so. That we can contact them and they'll say, well, okay, maybe. But on the whole, a good application of maleic hydroside is not going to result in application of a fungicide, and vice versa.
And another question for you there, Adrian. What impact on what's the impact on the Holm from application of MH?
Right, we've not actually seen an impact. We hear about it, and certainly on some crops there is mention on the label. We've not actually seen it, and last season we actually carried out some fairly high rates. So that piece of work that you showed the results for, we're actually looking to try and get higher levels of residue. So we carried out some 200% rate applications. And there we didn't get back any reports of damage.
Okay, so perhaps moving on towards the dormancy a little bit. We've had some questions on that. We've had a question here on some particular varieties. David was surprised in seeing that Melody is less dormant than Piper. Can store pre-pack Melody with temperature only until June, but quite surprised that that's not possible with Piper. So quite interesting to see those variation in dormancy levels between varieties. Simon, would you like to comment on that and the wide range of variation that we do see between varieties when it comes to dormancy?
No, definitely. I mean, I'm surprised. I would quite comfortably keep Melody through in a cold store till May, June without suppression, as long as you get it in good order and get it cooled and dried and so on in good time. And similarly, I think on the chart, I think there was a Desiree that is quite long, again, quite long dormancy. Yeah, I've seen Desiree break dormancy quite early in store and have had to treat it. So it's very difficult to draw conclusions from that based on sort of small experiments, if you like. And I suppose it's a lot of it. It's you've got to look at it and from own experience as much as anything.
So it's probably worth for growers, once they get a new variety, and to do some testing, do some trials to see how the setup of their actual stores makes a difference from data that's commonly available.
Yes, I think you need to do it over several years, because the problem is every year you get a different set of circumstances, and you need to then put all that together and try and get yourself a better conclusion. But at the moment, if you're just doing on one-off year, it's always likely to give you problem results.
Adrian, do you want to comment on that? I can see you nodding.
Yes, the Desiree in that trial was quite remarkable, because it had actually the longest dormancy of any variety, and that isn't typical. So we included that data because both sites, Spot North and Spot West, gave a similar results, that we had no reason to exclude. So it is difficult, and that's the full data set that we believe is accurate. But you're quite right, we shouldn't take single plots in single seasons as being the be all and end all of the dormancy question. Also on top of that, we shouldn't so dormancy is important. I would say, particularly as storage term extends, the other factor is low temperature tolerance. So this is perhaps not so important for pre-pack crops, but for processing varieties, if we can store at a lower temperature, that in itself extends dormancy, as well as reducing the rate of sprout growth once dormancy is broken.
So James, you grow Piper, don't you?
Yeah.
What's the dormancy been like for your crop, and I guess perhaps back in your agronomy days as well? Is that something that you looked at as well?
Yeah, so we've grown this year that we've applied MH to to Piper and to Burbanks, Russet Burbanks, and they've gone into separate stores. And the Burbanks are being treated with ethylene as well, but the Piper were contracted to be moved in December and January, so we were relying solely on MH in that store. Now the Piper lasted about 10 weeks before they started to break dormancy. Now we've not had to treat them, but they've gone as far as they could go. If we were keeping them any longer than we have done, then we would definitely have had to treat them with something else. Whereas the Burbanks, whether it's ethylene or whatever it might be, are rock solid. They're storing fine. So there is a bit, definitely a bit of variation there.
Great. So a question there around dormancy again. So perhaps one for you, Adrian, is low temperature delaying dormancy break or simply slowing down subsequent sprout development? Perhaps an interesting point of clarification in there.
Yeah, so reducing the temperature. So dormancy break is extended, or the period till dormancy break is extended by reducing the temperature. And once dormancy has broken, that low temperature will also restrict sprout growth. So it has a dual effect, if you like. So it has big advantages. Being low temperature tolerance gives us big advantages in terms of potato storage because of its effect on dormancy and the rate of sprout growth.
Yeah, and that there's trials ongoing at Sutton Bridge, isn't there, on low temperature tolerance as well. Yeah. Simon, what's the views there on that one?
Yeah, certainly. Again, from a storage point of view, getting potatoes into store, drying them and getting them cold will obviously reduce this dormancy break or speed to dormancy break. But as a seed, on a seed point of view, those same varieties might well sprout relatively quickly once you start to warm them up. So I understand what Paul is trying to drive at of that. Some varieties are dormant in store at cold temperatures, whereas they will sprout relatively quickly in normal conditions.
And we've had some interesting comments and thoughts as well on other sprout suppressants. So is MH, I think is a very good baseline treatment, but depending on whether you're storing long-term, short-term, depending on your market as well, you might need a top-up application for storing that bit longer. So I wonder, Adrian, whether you could perhaps give a very brief update on the trials that are going on at Sutton Bridge, looking at the varieties for processing and fresh back, when looking at those alternative sprout suppressants. So and in particular looking at that synergy between MH and ethylene and mint oil.
Okay. So at Sutton Bridge, basically for the last 3-4 years, we've been looking basically at all the registered sprout suppressants in the UK and in Europe, and some from further afield. So both mint, spearmint oil, and ethylene. So these are both products that were established in the pre-pack industry and now been slowly moved into the processing sector. Right. So both of those products work. Of course, they're sprout suppressants. They're registered pesticides, but they are a bit more. They do take more effort. So CIPC was remarkably easy, and we have become sort of quite accustomed to using it, and so that change is to ethylene to mint oil is perhaps showing some of the deficiencies in our stores, and maybe on occasion our store managers as well. So right, we're also expecting some of the new products. So we should have 2 new products this year: orange oil, which will be marketed as Argos, and DMN or 1,4 site. Hopefully we'll have full approval for that also this coming season. And then next year in 2022, we're expecting Smart Block to become available as well, all subject, of course, to CRD registering those products.
Great. That's a really useful information there. I wondered whether we could perhaps go back to MH and testing for residue levels. When is the best time to do that? Is there a best time? Obviously, in the trials, the testing was done straight after lifting. Is that something that people should do more to see how well they've done with their application?
Well, I certainly would encourage people to do testing. So growers are obviously making an investment in a product, and it's useful to know whether they're succeeding at what they're attempting to do. So with these products, there is an easy test, a residue test, and you will find out whether you succeeded or not. If you do decide to do a residue test, there is actually only one real way that you can do it. So it's all based around an MRL type test, and there is only one way that you can gather a sample that is suitable for MRL testing. So with MH, what I would recommend is if you're taking a crop from the field close to harvest time, what I would suggest is that you take 1 tuber from each of 12 plants, relatively randomly from a field. In store, I would take a single tuber from each of 12 boxes, or from 12 different positions in a bulk store. With maleic hydrazide, we're relatively lucky in that the residue is not transient. So the residue, once it's in the potatoes, it's there. We don't have to rush it to the lab very quickly, like we would, for example, with DMN. So the residue concentration remains fairly static.
Simon, would you like to come in on that as well? What do you tell the growers you work with on that?
Yes, well, to be fair, I've done quite a lot of residue testing this year, just because probably it's one of a significant year with MH. But I would definitely advocate what Adrian's saying. Growers should test their crops, and I think along with the test, I think they should record the actual conditions they actually applied it in. And if you build up a bit of a portfolio over the next few years, you might actually get an idea of when is the optimum time to apply to the particular variety and for the season. Because I've seen a huge range in uptake this year, from as low as sort of 5 parts per million up to over 30. And as I say, I've tried to record all the information, but we're just trying to number crunch that at the moment to see what it's going to show up. But definitely, it's an expensive product to apply, and as I say, it probably wants to be checked to see what sort of levels of uptake you get. I mean, this year is worth noting that I think it's been a very good year for dormancy. I think things have been very slow to break dormancy. There are 1 or 2 varieties out there, Innovator and Eurostar, that's been a bit problematic. But in general, putting the first sprout suppressant on has been quite late this year.
And James, is that something you've done, or perhaps advised growers as well? You know, doing residue tests with for MH.
Yeah. To be fair, what I tried to do, I blocked a lot of growers together. So if I get a big enough batch of samples, then we get a relatively cost-effective test. If you're doing them individually, it is expensive, and as I say, just to take a one-off sample down there, I think growers would get put off quite quickly. But I think if you can put them together, it makes a bit more sense, and the cost is not so much.
Oh, so a good tip there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Yeah, it needs to be cost effective, otherwise it won't be rolled out.
And have you done residue tests at all this year? Have you got that in the pipeline?
No, we haven't done. But again, I agree it's a good idea. So perhaps better have a word with Simon afterwards, maybe.
Sounds good. So yeah, some good tips. Good tips there. So we've had some more questions coming on other sprout suppressants. So and one interesting question to do with costs. So what's the relative costs of treatment? MH with mint oil or DMN or ethylene for the storage season in processing and pre-pack. Go on, Simon. I'll let you take that one first.
I think the cost of MH works out at a couple of pounds a ton, so it's cost effective if it works, and that's why I think it's so important to make sure you're actually getting decent uptake. So take the trouble to get the application right, and one thing another, and £2 a ton is worth spending if you get it right. In terms of DMN, I'm not entirely sure where the cost is going to come out, but a 20 mil application is, I think it's around £3 or £4 a ton. From off the top of my head, I'm not so entirely sure on that. Ethylene, again, you've got two systems out there, one a generated system and one using pure ethylene, and again they sort of cost them slightly differently. But again, I think just working from my own experience on pure ethylene, I think you could probably get it down to £1.50 a ton for the season. Now again, that doesn't suit all growers because the crisping industry is very much against the ethylene because of fry colour. Processing or French fries, again, seem to be advocating it. It seems to work all right for them. The bag trade for fish and chip trade, again, fry colour is very important. So ethylene is not widely used. I think I've known one grower using it, but that's all. They're tending to use mint oil this year because that's the only other option. So,
Adrian, did you want to come in and on those costs as well?
I think I'd agree with Simon. If fry colour is very important to you, so if you're in the sector, chip shop sector, then ethylene is probably not the correct choice, and like hydroside mint oil is probably the best.
James, I guess that's probably something as well, cost that you'll take into account.
Yeah,
what kind of approach have you been taking this year?
So we've been using ethylene in as an additional treatment, but that's been pretty much driven by McCain's themselves. So McCain's have channeled us down that route with our russet Burbanks, which obviously are destined for hopefully McDonald's fries. So they seem to be comfortable with fry colours in that instance, and so we're running with them. Really, it wasn't a conscious decision by ourselves to go with that. It was a case of working with the buyer to do what they wanted. If we got our cold stores and we need to treat them, then we would probably go down the mint oil route, but that's around about £5 a ton. So it's relatively expensive. So we're hoping that the temperature will hold them.
Right. So a question for Simon and Adrian. Have either of you seen any differences in length of storage with different ethylene concentrations?
It's an interesting one because the work that's done by Barbara Daniels Lake showed that there was very little difference above 4 ppm on ethylene on a dose response curve. That said, I suppose when ethylene came out sort of 10 years ago, we were working on, particularly in the sort of the fresh side, on 10 parts per million. But my experiences are you don't need to have it that high. I would think 6 to 7 is probably fine. But I suspect McCain's are saying that 4 parts per million is adequate on the work they've done.
We're running at 4.
Yeah.
And Adrian, what about the ethylene concentrations that have been used for the trials at Sutton Bridge, for example?
So we've always used the full rate, so 10 parts per million in the headspace. But I'm not disagreeing. But the work by Barbara Daniels-Lake does indeed support 4 parts per million as being effective.
And so we've had a question come in as well on DMN. So we know there's been full emergency approval, or there's been emergency approval, but we're still waiting on when the full approval might be expected. Adrian, what's when might that be expected? Have you got any insight on that at all?
I don't have a lot of insight on it. I know that the submission to CRD was made in March of last year, and so they would be required to respond to that in March of this year. So they basically have a year to reply. Whether there will be more questions, I don't know. It does seem like we've been waiting an awfully long time, DMN, and a time when obviously a number of other European countries have been using it.
So still a waiting game for that one.
Yes, I think the emergency approval is a step in the right direction, but to be honest, it's quite a small step. Rather restricted label.
Okay, well, I think we've had no more questions come in, but thanks everybody for feeding in your questions and your comments and experiences on how you've been getting on with MH and what you've seen out there in terms of dormancy and all the variation as well between varieties. So I think we're probably going to draw down to a close now. Well, I'd first like to thank our spot hosts that have hosted the trials for dormancy and NMH application optimization in the West and in the North. So thanks very much to them. I'd also like to thank our panelists. So thanks very much, James, Adrian, and Simon for coming in and giving us a bit of a bigger picture and drilling down into the details as well of those two tools available for growers. I think it's fair to say that there's storage now isn't going to be as straightforward as it was in the past. There's a lot of elements to take into account, as we've seen for MH and dormancy, as well as the other suppressants, and we'll have to have probably more of a careful approach as well to store management. So if I'd like to have the slide up as well for the points, so if you could just make sure you've made notes of that so that you're able to claim your points, that would be great. and we'll also get some, you'll get a feedback form coming in soon. So we'd really appreciate your feedback on how this session has gone and how you found the rest of the week, as well as we always strive to improve our events and make them as interesting and informative as possible. So thank you very much again to you all for joining us, for feeding in your questions. Thanks to our panelists, and hopefully we'll see you for the next and last session of Spot Farm Results Week on land preparation and cultivations seed placement. That starts at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So thank you very much to you all for joining, and we'll see you hopefully this afternoon. Thank you.